Hello, welcome to Tech Report channel. Here you can get new development of technology. Tech report from the globe. Keep touch with us. Subscribe this channel for up to date. Today's report is began. Today's topic is AMD or Intel for GeForce RTX 3080 benchmarking. Is C4.0 a factor? Well, did you know it's been 2 years since Nvidia introduced GeForce RTX 20 GPUs? Incredibly, it's been that long. And if you somehow haven't heard, next month they'll start rolling out the next generation of GPUs, aka Ampere, rumored to be much more powerful. That's certainly exciting and is something that will keep us busy in the weeks and months to come. Except that we've got a tough choice to make. You see, these new graphics cards will support PCI Express 4.0, but our GPU test system, which we just recently upgraded to the Core i9-10900K, doesn't. Rather, it's limited to C3.0. So we can either stay the course and do what we've always done, test with the fastest gaming CPU available at the time, and then investigate C4.0 performance on the side. At which point we'd be hoping it makes no difference, or we'll have to redo all our GPU data on a C4.0 compliant platform eventually. Or for the first time ever, we could switch the GPU test system over to AMD, knowing in some instances we might be sacrificing a little performance, but in return we'd have apples to apples data comparing older C3.0 graphics cards against the new C4.0 models, in a wide range of games at multiple resolutions. Another advantage to going with the Ryzen 9 3950X is that we'd be using the same processor architecture as many of you on the desktop. That one is debatable, but overall if we look at the stuff you buy after reading our reviews, Intel 8th, 9th and in particular their 10th gen core sales haven't been good for desktop CPUs. That's another reason for us to start testing GPUs with AMD. It's not the primary reason, but it is a reason. PCI Express 4.0 support is not a gimmick, and we suspect in the not too distant future it will hand AMD a performance advantage. Of course, Intel plans to support C4.0 with their next generation, but in the meantime the technology is exclusive to AMD. Still unsure as to which way we should go on this one. We ran a poll on the Hardware Unboxed channel and the response was overwhelming. 83% of the 52k people that voted requested we use the Ryzen 9. It's pretty clear what the majority wants, and that's a compelling enough reason to go with AMD. But before we make any final decisions, we thought it would be wise to dig into the data and see what we're giving up and potentially what we have to gain. If you recall, midway through last year we compared the Ryzen 9 3900X and Core i9-9900K in 36 games using a GeForce RTX 2080 Ti. All testing took place at 1080p, and what we found was that on average, the 3900X was 6% slower and in a few instances was a little faster. For the most part we were looking at single-digit margins, with the biggest loss seen when testing with StarCraft II, where the Ryzen processor was 16% slower. In that instance, although the gap was not huge, it made sense to test GPUs with the 9900K given C support wasn't a factor to consider. Today we want to benchmark a few of the games that'll be included in our upcoming next-gen GPU reviews, and we're looking at two things here. First, how much slower is the 3950X when compared to the 10900K, and we're not focusing exclusively on 1080p this time, as this won't be a resolution we'll include for GPUs pierced over $500. So if there's an RTX 3080 Ti, for example, the focus of that review will be 4K performance. Second, we want to see how the Radeon RX 5700 XT performs using these two processors, as it is currently the fastest GPU to support C4.0. Are we already starting to see some benefits for the increased C bandwidth, or will we have to wait for much faster graphics before the newer standard is of any benefit? For testing both platforms we configured our test beds with 32GB of DDR4-3200CL14 memory and the Corsair Hydro H150i Pro RGB AI liquid cooler. In total we have tested 9 games at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. Here is the benchmarks. Starting with Death Stranding at 1080p, we see when using the RTX 2080 Ti that the 10900K is 9% faster than the 3950X, which is a decent margin. Then with a slower 5700 XT that margin is reduced to just 2%. Now if we increase the resolution to 1440p, we find the margin is reduced to just 4% in favor of the 10900K, which is really insignificant. Here we also find virtually no difference between these two CPUs when using the 5700 XT, so this is very much a GPU limited test. Then finally at 4K both systems are entirely GPU bound as the 2080 Ti delivered the same level of performance with both CPUs. Interestingly, the 5700 XT was consistently a few frames faster with the 3950X and our 3-run average landed at 3% ahead, an insignificant margin, but interesting given what we saw at 1080p and 1440p. Like a lot of games, especially those using low-level APIs, Doom Eternal isn't very CPU demanding, and as a result, even at 1080p with an RTX 2080 Ti, we see the same level of performance on both platforms, and this was also true with the 5700 XT. Naturally, increasing the resolution does nothing to change that situation as the GPU bottleneck increases and this game doesn't appear to require excessive C bandwidth. Then at the 4K resolution we find more of the same. The 3950X has no trouble keeping pace with the 10900K in this title. Moving on we have F1 2020, and starting with the 1080p results it's clear the 10900K does enjoy a performance advantage in this title, boosting frame rates with the 2080 Ti by 8% over the 3950X. It was also 5% faster with the 5700 XT, so not massive margins, but the Intel CPU is clearly faster under these conditions. However, we again find that increasing the resolution does start to reduce those margins, and now the 10900K is just 5% faster with the 2080 Ti and 3% faster with the 5700 XT, both of which we'd say are insignificant differences. Then finally at the 4K resolution there is no distinguishing between the 10900K and 3950X. Even with the 2080 Ti we're looking at the same 95 FPS on average. Next up we have Metro Exodus, and here we're again finding the 10900K to be up to 8% faster at 1080p when comparing the average frame rate, though it was just 3% faster with the 5700 XT. Again, the margin is reduced at 1440p, and now the Intel CPU is just 5% faster with the 2080 Ti and just 2% faster with the 5700 XT. Then once again we're looking at identical performance at 4K, where we're entirely GPU limited and the CPU choice makes no difference when testing with a high-end C3.0 graphics card. Like Doom Eternal, and many other games for that matter, Resident Evil 3 isn't very CPU sensitive, and as a result even at 1080p, there's no difference in performance between these two CPUs with either GPU. The same is true at 1440p, though the 3950X was actually slightly faster than the 10900K here. We're talking just a few frames, but it was consistently faster, so that's interesting. Then as we bump the resolution up to 4K, the 3950X pulled further ahead with the 2080 Ti and is now up to 5% faster, which was somewhat of an unexpected result. Not a huge margin, but it is a small win for the red team. When testing with Rainbow Six Siege we find that the 10900K was 7% faster with the 2080 Ti at 1080p. It's a reasonable increase in FPS given we're talking about a 7% increase from 364 FPS, but we're also only testing at 1080p. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a very CPU demanding game, though please note for this test we're using the built-in benchmark as we often do for GPU testing. Here the 3950X and 10900K delivered virtually identical performance with both the 2080T and 5700XT. That being the case, we find the same story at 1440p, identical performance with both GPUs. Then at 4K the results are much the same, though the 3950X was consistently 1-2 FPS faster, which is curious. Wolfenstein Youngblood, like Doom Eternal, is not a CPU sensitive game. So at 1080p we're seeing virtually identical performance using either CPU, with a small 3% performance advantage in Intel favor. That being the case, there's nothing in it at 1440p, so either CPU is able to maximize performance with the 2080T. And of course, the same is true of the 4K resolution. Here the CPU used doesn't matter, while assuming it's either a 10900K or 3950X. Last up we have Horizon Zero Dawn results, and this game is a bit of a roller coaster. At 1080p we find some devastating results for AMD, as the 10900K is 18% faster here and adds a significant margin. We see virtually no difference when using the 5700XT, but it's the 2080T results that are the issue. Even at 1440p the 2080T is still 9% faster with the 10900K, 14% faster if we look at the 1% low performance. However, we also see something else here that's very interesting. The 5700XT is up to 9% faster with the 3950X, though it's just 3% faster on average. Not huge margins, but the Radeon GPU was consistently faster with the 3950X, a strong suggestion that the extra C bandwidth is being utilized here. At 4K, the 10900K is just 3% faster when comparing the average frame rates, while the 3950X was 6% faster with the 5700XT. So based on that, if the 2080T supported C4.0 there, the performance summary is: those results weren't terribly surprising. We've benchmarked the crap out of Intel's Core series and AMD Ryzen processors at this point, so we have a very good idea as to how they compare. That said, it was interesting to see the 3950X often offering a little extra at 4K, and in a few instances we saw better performance with the 5700XT, presumably due to the C4.0 support. But before we get into that, let's quickly go over the data. When you consider the fact that the Ryzen 9 3950X was just 2% slower on average at 1440p, it's not a stretch to say that the margin could be reduced to nothing, or even swing a few percent in AMD's favor with a more powerful GPU supporting C4.0, especially when testing with the latest and greatest games. For new GPU releases we are not interested in testing games such as StarCraft II, World of Tanks, Rocket League, Fortnite, CSGO, and so on. They are not exactly cutting edge titles, and as such they're not going to push next gen hardware to its limits. Get an RTX 2060 if that's all you want to play. Games that we'd like to add to this list include titles such as Microsoft's Flight Simulator 2020 and Cyberpunk 2077, for example. As a side note, if you do care about performance in esports titles and you want to know what CPU to get, we do have an entire series dedicated to that testing. On that note, further luring us towards the 3950X is that few or maybe even no other reviewers will use it for testing next-gen GPUs. Breaking away from the norm can be risk, but giving us confidence to give it a shot is 83% of you. Whichever way we go, there's a good chance before long we'll throw all that data away and start over again once Zen 3 arrives, if Zen 3 is as good as we think it's going to be, making this decision much easier. Do let me know what you think about this data. Was any of it surprising? And ultimately, what do you think we should do? Ditch Intel in favor of AMD, or stick with our current Core i9-10900K test system? Well, that's the end of our first session. Thanks for watching this video. See you on the second session. Till then, Have a nice day, take care friend, bye.